Tom, an 8-year-old kid, in the happiest day of his dad's life, Tom made a choice that turned everything upside down. Tom accuses Jessica, his father's fiancée, of being a dangerous woman, hiding some serious secrets. Tom stepped up and dropped a bombshell that no one saw coming. His actions brought the wedding to a screeching halt. But what followed left everyone speechless. Why did Tom's revelation have such a huge impact? How did this little boy's courage expose the truth about his dad's fiancée? And how did it change their lives forever? Stick around to hear the whole story. The sunlight poured through the large chapel windows, creating a soft, golden glow that filled the room. The quiet murmur of excited conversation rippled through the guests as they exchanged glances, each of them waiting for the big moment. Up at the altar, Billy Williams stood, looking sharp in his black tuxedo. A hint of nerves flashed across his face, but his smile was steady as he stood there, waiting for his bride. "You look awesome, Dad," whispered Tom, Billy's 8-year-old son, shifting from foot to foot. He held a small pillow tightly in his hands, the rings sitting on top. His dark, curly hair was neatly combed, and his tiny suit was an exact match to his dad's. While Billy's face was filled with happiness, Tom's brown eyes looked troubled. Billy glanced down, catching his son's gaze. "Thanks, buddy," he said softly, giving Tom a playful wink. "You're the best ring-bearer a dad could ask for." He gave Tom's hair a light ruffle, clearly missing the worry that clung to the boy's expression. The first notes of the wedding march played, and the guests all rose from their seats, heads turning toward the back of the chapel where the bride was about to appear. All except Tom. His eyes stayed glued to his dad, his small fingers clutching the pillow so tightly his knuckles were pale. The doors swung open, and there was Jessica, glowing in her wedding gown. She was breathtaking, her white dress shimmering under the light, and her blonde hair cascaded down her back like a waterfall. Her bright blue eyes sparkled with joy as she walked down the aisle. As soon as Billy caught sight of her, his whole face lit up, his eyes filled with nothing but love. "You look amazing," Billy whispered, as Jessica reached the altar and stood beside him. She smiled, her voice a soft murmur. "I can't wait to start this journey with you." The officiant began speaking, his voice echoing in the chapel, but Tom could barely hear him. Time seemed to drag on, painfully slow for the boy. He fidgeted, his eyes bouncing between his dad and Jessica, feeling something more than just nerves gnawing at him. Tom's mind drifted back to when he first met Jessica. It had been a few months ago, on a cool autumn afternoon. Billy had picked him up from school, grinning from ear to ear. "I've got someone special for you to meet, buddy," Billy had said, excitement practically bubbling out of him as they drove home. Since his mum had passed 2 years ago, it had just been him and his dad. The idea of a new person stepping into their world felt unsettling. When they pulled up to the house, there she was, Jessica, sitting on the porch, her blonde hair catching the golden light of the late afternoon sun. She gave them a welcoming smile, and Tom noticed how his dad's face lit up as he looked at her. "She's become really important to me, and I hope she'll become important to you too." Jessica knelt down so that she was at Tom's eye level. "It's so good to finally meet you, Tom," she said gently, her blue eyes warm. "Your dad talks about you all the time." In that moment, Tom felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this could work. His dad spending more time with Jessica and less with him. They didn't go to the park as much, or throw a football in the yard like they used to. It was as if Jessica had slowly slid into a space that used to be just him and his dad's. He shook the thoughts from his head and looked back at his dad, watching him smile at Jessica. Billy seemed so happy, more than he had been in a long time. Maybe that was a good thing. Maybe everything would be okay. But that small voice inside him still wondered. Would his dad still have time for him now? Would it always be the three of them from now on? When the officiant asked for the rings, Tom snapped back to the present. Tom stepped forward, doing his best to shake off the strange feelings swirling in his chest. He handed over the rings, his dad giving him another wink of encouragement. As Billy and Jessica slipped the rings onto each other's fingers, the guests cheered, and the sound of applause filled the air. Tom watched them, trying to convince himself that things would be okay, that somehow he'd still have his dad, even if he had to share him now. But as the celebration carried on around him, he couldn't help but feel like he was standing just a little bit outside of it all, watching from a distance. Tom's stomach churned as he thought about what was happening. One night his father worked late, and Jessica was supposed to be watching him. They sat at the dinner table, the silence thick between them. "Miss Jessica," Tom began hesitantly, "do you like space? We're learning about it in school. Tom," Jessica interrupted, her eyes glued to her phone. "I'm busy right now. Eat quietly." Tom shrank back in his chair, poking at his food with his fork. The silence felt heavier than before. When his dad was home, though, it was a completely different story. Jessica would laugh at Tom's jokes, ask him about school, and even ruffle his hair. But Tom saw the cracks in her smile, the tension that lurked behind her eyes. His dad, on the other hand, seemed happier than Tom had seen him in years. He hummed while making breakfast, danced around the kitchen and smiled at everything Jessica did. "Isn't Jessica great?" his dad would say, eyes sparkling. "We're lucky to have her, right?" Tom would nod, forcing a smile, not wanting to break the bubble of happiness his dad had found. But inside, he felt lonelier than ever, confused by the drastic differences in Jessica's behavior. As the weeks turned into months, Jessica's true colors began to show more often. When Billy wasn't within earshot, she became sharper, more cutting. "Tom," she would say with a sigh, looking at the clutter from his school project, "I really don't know how your dad manages you." Or when Tom would proudly show her a good grade he'd gotten on a test, but she didn't care. Tom felt lost in his own house. He began retreating to his room more and more, avoiding the shared spaces of the house whenever possible. One Saturday afternoon, about 3 months before the wedding, something happened that Tom couldn't forget. His dad had gone out to run errands, leaving him alone with Jessica. Tom was in the living room, watching cartoons and sipping on a glass of juice. Jessica walked in, her expression already sour. "Turn that off," she snapped, motioning toward the TV. "It's too loud. I'm trying to work." Startled, Tom fumbled with the remote. In his rush to lower the volume, he knocked his juice over, spilling it across the coffee table and onto the carpet. "I'm sorry," Tom cried, jumping up to grab some napkins. "I didn't mean to—" Before he could finish, Jessica grabbed his arm, her fingers digging painfully into his skin as she yanked him away from the mess. "Do you even think before you act?" she hissed, her face twisted in frustration. "Clean this up. Now." Tears welled up in Tom's eyes as he hurried to mop up the spill, his hands shaking. The pain in his arm lingered long after Jessica let go. Jessica's eyes narrowed dangerously as she leaned closer. "You better clean it up," she growled, her voice low. "And if you so much as think about telling your father, you'll regret it. Do you understand me?" Tom nodded quickly, his heart racing with fear. As soon as Jessica let go of his arm, he scrambled to clean up the mess, his hands shaking uncontrollably. That evening, when Billy came home, Jessica greeted him with a bright smile and a cheerful, "How was your day, honey?" She kissed him like everything was perfect. Tom stood at the top of the stairs, rubbing the spot on his arm where Jessica had grabbed him, feeling more isolated than ever. He watched his father laugh and relax, completely unaware of what had happened while he was gone. As the wedding day inched closer, the weight of the secret Tom was carrying seemed heavier by the day. He wanted so badly to tell his father the truth, to let him know that Jessica wasn't the kind, loving person she pretended to be. But fear held him back. What if his dad didn't believe him? Worse, what if telling his dad only made Jessica angrier? One evening, about a month before the wedding, Tom finally gathered the courage to speak up. Billy was sitting in his study, flipping through paperwork, when Tom softly knocked on the door. "Come on in, buddy." Billy's voice was warm, and he smiled when Tom stepped into the room. "What's up?" Tom hesitated, his fingers nervously twisting the edge of his shirt. "Dad, can I talk to you about something?" Billy immediately set his papers aside, his full attention on his son. "Of course, kiddo. What's on your mind?" Tom took a deep breath, his heart pounding. "It's about Jessica," he said, his voice shaky. "I don't think she likes me very much." Billy's face shifted to a look of confusion. "What do you mean, Tom? Jessica loves you. She talks about how great you are all the time." "No, Dad, she doesn't." Tom's words spilled out, faster and more desperate now. "She's different when you're not around. She ignores me, and sometimes she says mean things, and—" "Whoa, slow down," Billy interrupted gently, holding up his hand. He sighed and ran his fingers through his hair, clearly trying to find the right words. "Tom, I know this is a lot of change for you. It's not easy getting used to someone new joining the family, but I promise, Jessica cares about you a lot." "But, Dad," Tom started, but Billy shook his head. "No buts, son," he said, his tone firm but kind. "Jessica's going to be your stepmom soon, and I need you to give her a chance. We're all trying our best, and so is she, all right?" Tom's shoulders slumped in defeat. "Okay, Dad," he mumbled, turning to leave the room. As he closed the door behind him, a crushing feeling of hopelessness washed over him. His father, the one person he had always counted on, didn't believe him. Or maybe worse, didn't want to believe him. From that night on, Tom stopped trying to tell his dad anything about Jessica. Instead, he withdrew further into himself, growing quieter and more distant. He dreaded family dinners, knowing he'd have to sit across from Jessica and act like everything was fine. He dreaded weekends, trips, and any moment he'd have to endure Jessica's coldness or subtle insults, while Billy remained blissfully unaware. Billy, consumed with wedding plans and his own happiness, never noticed how much his son was fading into the background. Tom always thought his stepmom-to-be's behavior was just her way of being strict or trying to adjust to their new family dynamic. His dad, Billy, had no clue what was really happening, and Tom was too scared to say anything. Jessica, on the other hand, seemed to grow more confident in her harshness toward Tom, especially when no one was around. One afternoon, Tom was walking down the hallway when he overheard Jessica talking to her friend Sarah. He stopped in his tracks, trying to make out what they were saying. "I don't know how you manage it," Sarah said, her tone casual but curious. "Raising someone else's kid? I wouldn't have the patience." He held his breath, waiting for Jessica's response. "Oh, it's not that bad," Jessica said with fake sweetness. "Tom's just part of the package, you know. You've got to take the good with the bad." Sarah chuckled. "You're a saint, Jessica. If it were me, I'd send him off to some boarding school by now." Tom couldn't bear to hear any more. He hurried back to his room, the pit in his stomach growing heavier by the second. Part of the package? The bad? Was that all he was to her? Just something to put up with because she wanted his dad. As the wedding drew closer, Tom felt more and more out of place. His dad and Jessica talked non-stop about honeymoon destinations, how they'd redecorate the house, but they never asked Tom what he thought. It was like he didn't matter. He was invisible in his own home. One night, unable to sleep, Tom tossed and turned in bed. The clock on his nightstand flashed 11:42 p.m., its red light casting faint shadows on the walls. Sighing, he got up to get some water from the kitchen. He tiptoed down the hallway, but something made him stop. Voices. He could hear Jessica talking, but her tone was nothing like the sugary voice she used around his dad. It was sharp, angry. Tom froze and pressed himself against the wall, peeking around the corner. "James, you've got to be patient," she whispered fiercely into her phone, pacing the living room. Her blonde hair was messy, and she kept running her fingers through it, looking stressed. "We can't rush this. Everything has to go perfectly." Tom's heart started pounding in his chest. He had never seen Jessica like this before. So angry, so desperate. What was she talking about? "The wedding is in 2 weeks," Jessica continued, her voice lowering as she threw a glance toward the hallway, unaware Tom was watching. "Once that's over, we move to phase 2. Billy doesn't suspect anything. He's clueless." Tom's confusion deepened. Phase 2A. What was she planning? He knew he shouldn't be listening, but his feet felt glued to the floor. "Yeah, the insurance policy," Jessica hissed into the phone. "Once we get that money, we're out. No more scams. This is the last one." Tom's stomach dropped further. Insurance policy? Scams? He struggled to make sense of what he was hearing, but Jessica's words were sending chills down his spine. "Tom's the only problem," she added with a sneer. "He's too nosy, always paying attention to things he shouldn't. But don't worry, I've got him under control. Billy's so wrapped up in me, he won't believe anything that kid says." Tom felt his eyes sting with tears. He knew Jessica didn't like him, but hearing her talk about him like that, like he was a burden, hurt in a way he hadn't expected. "Just be ready," she said in a cold, determined voice. 2 weeks after the wedding, we're done. Billy won't see it coming." Jessica hung up the phone, and Tom scrambled back to his room as fast as he could without making a sound. His heart pounded in his chest, echoing in his ears. He dove under the covers, his mind racing with what he had just overheard. Jessica was planning something, and it was bad. Something about his dad, money, and this mysterious insurance policy. Tom didn't know exactly what it all meant, but one thing was clear. He had to do something before it was too late. Tom couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. His father, Billy, was in danger, and sleep had evaded him the entire night. Tossing and turning, he replayed Jessica's words in his mind, her voice still ringing in his ears. When morning finally came, he dragged himself to the breakfast table, where Billy and Jessica sat, looking perfectly at ease, as if nothing was out of place. "Morning, champ," Billy greeted, ruffling Tom's hair. "You look wiped out. Bad night?" Tom forced a nod, doing his best to avoid eye contact with Jessica. "Yeah, just couldn't sleep," he muttered. "Oh, poor thing," Jessica cooed, her tone sugary sweet. "Bet you're just excited about the wedding, aren't you, Tom?" He looked up and met her gaze, but for a brief moment he saw something hidden behind her smile, something cold, calculating. It sent a chill down his spine. "Yeah," he lied, trying to smile. "Excited." Over the next few days, Tom kept a close watch on Jessica, suspicious of everything she did. Now that his eyes were open, the things he used to overlook became impossible to ignore. Jessica was constantly on her phone, texting someone furiously. As soon as Billy walked in, she'd lock the screen with a bright smile. "Just the wedding planner," she'd say, or, "Oh, the usual bridesmaid drama." But Tom wasn't buying it. He managed to catch a glimpse of her phone once, a text conversation with someone saved as M. He figured it had to be James, the man she'd been talking to in that strange phone call. Her disappearances became more frequent too. "I'm just running out to handle some wedding details," she'd tell Billy with a kiss on the cheek, or last-minute dress fitting with the girls. Billy, still head over heels, didn't question her, but Tom saw through the act. He noticed everything. One afternoon, about a week before the wedding, Tom was helping Billy in the garage when Jessica's car pulled up. She barely glanced their way before hurrying inside. "I'm gonna grab a snack, Dad," Tom said, wiping his hands. Billy nodded, focused on fixing the lawnmower. "Sure thing. Grab me a soda too, will you?" Tom slipped quietly into the house, but he could hear Jessica's muffled voice upstairs. Curiosity got the best of him, and he crept up, careful to avoid the squeaky third step. "Almost there, Jane," Jessica was saying. Her voice came from the guest room, the one that would be hers and Billy's after the wedding. "Just a few more days." Tom's heart raced as he tiptoed closer, pressing his ear to the door. Jessica continued, her voice low. "Once we're married, it'll be simple. An accident, a grieving widow, and we're all set. Just follow the plan." Tom's blood froze. An accident? Were they planning to hurt his dad? Jessica's voice dropped to a near whisper, and Tom leaned in to catch her words. But in his haste, he bumped the door, causing it to creak. The room went silent. "I've got to go," Jessica said quickly. "I'll call you later." Panicking, Tom hurried down the hallway, ducking into the bathroom before Jessica could see him. His heart pounded in his chest as he slumped against the wall, trying to catch his breath. This was worse than he'd imagined. Jessica and this James guy weren't just after money. They were planning something far more sinister. Something that could end in tragedy. Over the next few days, Tom kept a close eye on Jessica, trying to figure out what to do. He knew no one would believe him, especially not his dad. Billy thought Jessica could do no wrong, and Jessica had proven more than once that she could twist the truth to suit her needs. Then, one evening, Tom walked into the study and found Jessica at Billy's laptop. She jumped when she saw him, a guilty look flashing across her face. "Oh, Tom, you startled me." Her voice was too bright, too fake. "I was just checking the RSVPs for the wedding." Tom nodded, but he didn't buy it. As soon as Jessica left the room, he rushed to the laptop. It was locked, but Tom knew the password. It was his birthday. The browser history had been wiped clean, but one tab was still open. He clicked on it, his hands trembling. Tom's heart pounded as he stared at the screen in front of him. The website for a big life insurance company glowed on the laptop. This had to be the policy Jessica had been dropping hints about. He wanted to dig further, but heard footsteps approaching. Quickly, he slammed the laptop shut and shifted his attention to the bookshelf. Billy, his dad, entered the room with a warm smile. "Hey, sport, what are you up to?" "Just looking for a book," Tom lied smoothly, hating how natural it was becoming to deceive his dad. Billy ruffled his hair, completely oblivious. "That's my boy. Always got your nose in a book. Come on, dinner's ready." As they walked toward the dining room, Tom's mind raced. He had to stop whatever Jessica was planning, but how? The next day, Tom found his opportunity. Billy had an unexpected meeting at work, and Jessica had left the house on one of her mysterious errands. Alone, Tom made his way to Jessica's sleek silver laptop. His hands shook as he opened it. Unsurprisingly, it was locked with a password. He tried a few things. Her birthday, the day she and his dad got married. Nothing worked. Just as he was about to give up, he noticed a sticky note tucked under the edge of the laptop. It had a string of numbers and letters. Was it her password? His heart pounded as he typed in the code. The screen unlocked, and Tom was in. His eyes widened as he scrolled through her files. There were documents with suspicious titles, including one labeled Insurance Policy. Tom clicked on it, revealing a PDF filled with legal jargon. His mind swirled with confusion, but one phrase jumped out at him. Accidental death. Double indemnity. $5 million payout. $5 million. Was that what his dad's life was worth to her? Tom's hands trembled as he continued exploring. A folder named Jame caught his eye. He clicked on it and found pictures of a man he didn't recognize. Tall, dark-haired, with a scar above his left eyebrow. In some of the photos, the man was alone, but in others, he was with Jessica. They looked close, too close. His stomach churned. Not only was Jessica planning something horrible, but she was also seeing this man behind his dad's back. Suddenly, the sound of a car pulling into the driveway made his heart jump. Jessica was back. In a panic, Tom hurriedly closed the files and shut down the laptop, setting everything back exactly the way it was. Just as he sat down, he heard the front door creak open. "Tom?" Jessica called out. "You here?" "Yeah," he replied, doing his best to keep his voice calm. "Just doing some homework." Jessica appeared at the doorway, her gaze sweeping over the room. "In the study? Don't you usually work in your room?" Tom shrugged, trying to act casual. "It's quieter here." She stared at him for a long, uncomfortable moment before flashing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Well, don't work too hard. Dinner's almost ready." As she turned to leave, Tom caught a glimpse of her phone screen. She was texting someone. The name simply said M. That night, Tom lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. His mind wouldn't stop spinning. Jessica and Jame were planning to kill his dad for the insurance money. They were going to wait until after the wedding, then stage some kind of accident. He was just a kid. How could he possibly stop two adults from carrying out their twisted plan? And with the wedding only a few days away, time was slipping through his fingers. He thought about telling his dad, but would he believe him? Jessica had spent so much time convincing Billy that Tom was just an envious, difficult child. Would his dad trust him over the woman he was about to marry? Tom tossed and turned, but eventually a decision settled in his heart. He couldn't just sit back and let this happen. Somehow, some way, he had to stop the wedding. He had to save his dad. With that determination, Tom finally drifted off to sleep. His dreams were filled with haunting images. Jessica and Jame standing over a grave, laughing. His father's grave. Tom jolted awake, heart racing, sweat covering his forehead. His breath came in quick, shallow gasps as he tried to shake off the remnants of the nightmare. But deep down, Tom knew it wasn't just a bad dream. It was a warning. He couldn't let the wedding happen, no matter what it cost. Back to the present. The wedding ceremony was already in motion. And Tom sat there, a knot of fear tightening in his chest. The officiant's words seemed distant and meaningless, drowned out by the pounding in his ears. His mind raced, filled with dread. He had to act, had to say something before it was too late. If anyone can show just cause why this couple should not be lawfully joined together in matrimony, speak now or forever hold your peace. The familiar words echoed through the church, hanging in the air. This was his moment. But fear gripped him, freezing him in place. What if he was wrong? What if no one believed him? Worse, what if he ruined everything for no reason? The officiant paused, about to move forward with the ceremony. Tom's heart pounded louder, his hands trembled, palms sweating. It was now or never. "Wait!" The word exploded from Tom's mouth before he could stop it. "Stop the wedding!" A collective gasp swept through the guests. All eyes turned to Tom, who stood there shaking, his voice trembling in the sudden, stunned silence. "Tom?" Billy, his father, spun around in confusion, concern etched into his face. "What's going on, son? What's wrong?" Tom's gaze darted from his dad to Jessica, the bride-to-be, who stared back at him, her eyes wide with shock and a flicker of anger she barely managed to hide. He took a deep breath. "Dad, you can't marry her. She's not who you think she is." Billy knelt down, gently gripping his son's shoulder. "Tom, what are you talking about? Are you feeling okay?" Tom shook his head, his voice breaking. "No, Dad, you don't get it. She's been lying to you. She's planning something bad." A ripple of murmurs went through the crowd. Jessica let out a nervous laugh, her eyes darting from Billy to the curious faces of the guests. "Oh, sweetheart," she said, her voice sugar-coated with fake kindness. "I understand this is hard for you. A new mom can be scary, but this isn't how you should be handling it." Tom's face flushed with anger. "No!" he shouted, louder this time. "That's not it at all. I heard you talking to James on the phone. I know about the insurance policy. You're planning to hurt my dad." The church fell into a deathly silence. Billy's face went pale, disbelief written all over him. "Tom, that's a very serious thing to say. Where on earth did you hear something like that?" "I overheard her, Dad," Tom said, his voice desperate. "Late at night. She was talking to some guy named James. They were talking about money and insurance and how they'd get rid of you after the wedding." Jessica's nervous laugh came out shriller this time, with a tinge of hysteria creeping in. "Billy, you can't seriously be buying into this. It's absurd. James is the wedding planner. Of course we've been discussing the insurance for the event and money for the vendors. Tom's just confused." But Tom wasn't backing down. "No, I'm not. I saw the insurance policy on your laptop. Millions of dollars if Dad dies. And I saw photos of you and James together. He's not just your wedding planner." Gasps and murmurs rose from the guests, filling the room with a tense buzz. Some looked scandalized, others whispered among themselves, casting suspicious glances at Jessica. Billy stood frozen, his eyes flickering between Tom and Jessica, disbelief and uncertainty battling on his face. Jessica's complexion had drained of color. Her perfectly composed expression was starting to crumble. She reached for Billy's hand, her voice quivering. "Billy, please," she whispered. "You know me. I would never— This is ridiculous. Tom's just a kid. He doesn't understand what he's saying." But Billy's hand pulled away from hers, his eyes dark with doubt. The entire room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for what would happen next. Billy's face showed deep concern, clearly conflicted. "Tom," he said slowly, "what you're saying, it's serious. Are you absolutely sure about what you heard and saw?" Tom nodded vigorously, tears brimming in his eyes. "I'm sure, Dad. I wouldn't make this up. Jessica's been mean to me for months, but only when you're not around. She makes me feel horrible, and now she's planning to hurt you. Please, Dad, you have to believe me." Billy's emotions swirled, confusion, hurt, disbelief. He turned to Jessica, his voice low and tense. "Jessica, is any of this true? Even a little?" Jessica's calm facade faltered. Her eyes darted around the room, taking in the shocked faces of the wedding guests, the stern look from the officiant, and Tom's pleading expression. For a brief moment, she appeared trapped, but then, just as quickly, her demeanor shifted. Her eyes hardened, and her lips formed a tight, unforgiving line. "This is ridiculous," she snapped. "I don't have to stand here and be accused by a spoiled brat who can't handle sharing his daddy's attention." She turned to the crowd, addressing them like a polished politician. "I'm sorry you all had to witness this tantrum. It's clear Tom has some issues that we as a family need to work on. She looked back at Billy. Maybe we should postpone the ceremony just for now. But Billy didn't let her finish. His voice was quiet, but resolute. No, Jessica, we're not postponing. We need to deal with this right now. Because if there's any truth to what Tom's saying... Jessica's eyes flashed dangerously. You can't be serious. You're going to believe the wild stories of an 8-year-old over me, your fiancée, the woman you're supposed to love? Billy's face was troubled. I love my son too, Jessica. And Tom. He's never lied to me before. He's not the kind of kid to make something like this up. Tom felt a wave of relief wash over him. His dad was listening, but Jessica wasn't ready to give up. This is absurd, she cried, her voice growing louder. I have done nothing but love you, Billy. I've tried to be a mother to Tom, and this is how I'm repaid, with baseless accusations and distrust. She whipped around to face Tom, her eyes blazing with fury. You little brat, she hissed, forgetting where she was. You've ruined everything. A shocked gasp rippled through the crowd. Billy's eyes widened as if seeing Jessica in a new light. The words struck him like a punch, revealing a side of her he'd never seen before, and it shook him to the core. Jessica, he whispered, what have you done? Realizing her mistake, Jessica quickly tried to recover, forcing an awkward laugh. Oh, Billy, can't you see? This is all just too much. The stress, Tom's meltdown, these crazy accusations. I just lost my temper for a second. You understand? Right? He crouched down beside Tom, looking his son directly in the eyes. Tom, I need you to tell me everything, from the beginning. Don't leave anything out. And so, with the whole room watching, Tom began to speak. He told his father about how Jessica's behavior changed when they were alone, the harsh words, the hurtful looks, and the times she'd made him feel small. Tom began to recount what he'd found on Jessica's computer, the insurance policy, the photos of her with James. Billy's face turned ghostly pale. The guests were frozen in shock, with some shaking their heads in disbelief, while others slowly nodded, as if the pieces of a confusing puzzle were finally making sense. Jessica stood still, her eyes darting between Billy and the door. As Tom continued, her calm expression slowly dissolved. By the time Tom finished, she no longer resembled the glowing bride who had just walked down the aisle. Is this true? Billy asked, his voice thick with disbelief and hurt. Jessica, look me in the eye and tell me none of this is true. Jessica opened her mouth, but no words came out. The warmth that used to fill her eyes was gone, replaced with a cold, calculating stare. In that instant, Billy saw the truth clearly, and it shattered his heart. I think, Billy said, his voice unsteady, this wedding is over. A wave of chaos swept through the church. Guests stood up, some heading for the doors, others pushing closer to catch what was happening. Amidst the commotion, Jessica saw her chance. With a sharp, frustrated breath, she turned and bolted down the aisle, her white dress flowing behind her like a billowing cloud. She shoved her way past stunned guests, heading straight for the exit. "Stop her!" someone shouted. But Jessica was quick. She pushed open the heavy church doors and ran out into the glaring sunlight, leaving behind a scene of utter mayhem. The church exploded into noise as people tried to comprehend what had just happened. His hands trembled as he pulled out his phone and dialed 911. "Yes, hello? I need to report a crime," Billy said, his voice shaky. "My fiancée. She was planning to kill me for the insurance money. She just ran out of our wedding. Please, you have to find her." He gave the dispatcher a description of Jessica and the direction she'd fled. Meanwhile, Tom stood frozen in place, overwhelmed by everything he'd just set into motion. Relief mixed with a deep sense of worry twisted in his gut. He had saved his father, but what would happen now? After finishing his call, Billy turned toward his son. His face was a mix of pain, gratitude, and regret. He knelt down and placed both hands on Tom's shoulders. "Tom," Billy said, his voice rough with emotion. "I'm so sorry. I should have listened to you. I should have seen the signs." Tom wrapped his arms tightly around his father's neck, burying his face in his shoulder. "It's okay, Dad," he mumbled, his voice muffled. "I'm just glad you're safe." Billy pulled Tom into a tight embrace, tears filling his eyes. For a brief moment the chaos around them faded, and it was just father and son, holding on to each other amidst the storm. Their quiet moment was soon interrupted by the sound of approaching police officers. 2 police officers stepped into the church, and the room quieted down almost immediately. The soft buzz of conversations faded as every eye turned toward them. "Mr. William?" one of the officers asked, walking up to Billy and Tom. Billy stood up, keeping one hand on Tom's shoulder for reassurance. "Yes, that's me," Billy replied. "I'm Officer Jaden, and this is my partner, Officer Rivera," the officer said. "We need to ask you a few questions about what happened here." Billy began explaining the events to the officers, but Tom's attention shifted toward the church entrance. A man with dark hair and a noticeable scar above his left eyebrow was forcing his way through the crowd, looking desperate. Tom's heart skipped a beat. He recognized the man from the photos on Jessica's computer. It was James. "Dad," Tom whispered urgently, tugging at Billy's sleeve. "Dad, that's him. That's James." Billy's gaze followed Tom's, and recognition washed over him. He remembered the description Tom had given earlier. Without hesitation, he turned to the officers. "That man," Billy said, pointing toward the entrance. "I think he's involved. He's the one my son heard Jessica talking to on the phone." The officers sprang into action. Officer Jaden stayed with Billy and Tom, while Officer Rivera moved swiftly toward the man who had already started backing out of the church. "Sir, stop right there," Officer Rivera called out, his voice firm. James froze for a brief moment, scanning the room with the wild look of someone trapped. Then, without warning, he bolted, sprinting toward the exit. Officer Rivera was right behind him, radioing for backup as he gave chase. The wedding guests were left in stunned silence, watching the scene unfold. The church doors slammed shut behind Officer Rivera as he disappeared in pursuit of the fleeing man. "Mr. William," Officer Jaden said calmly, though his voice held an air of urgency, "it would be best if you and your son came down to the station to give a full statement. We'll need any evidence you have related to Miss Jessica's plans." Billy nodded, still trying to process everything. "Of course," he muttered. As Billy and Tom followed Officer Jaden out of the church, they could hear Jack addressing the guests behind them. His voice was calm and steady, reassuring the crowd as he explained the situation and politely asked them to head home. Billy glanced down at Tom, squeezing his shoulder a little tighter, knowing that the hardest part was still ahead of them. The drive to the police station felt unreal, like a strange dream. Tom sat quietly in the back seat of the police car, staring out the window as they drove through streets he had known his entire life. His father, Billy, sat beside him, silent and lost in thought, his face blank as he gazed out at the passing scenery. "Jessica brought up the idea of increasing my life insurance. She said it was to make sure Tom would be taken care of, if anything happened to me." He paused, as if trying to understand his own words. "And then she started pushing us to do these risky activities together. Rock climbing, skydiving. She even suggested swimming with sharks on our honeymoon." Tom glanced at his dad, seeing the deep confusion and hurt in his eyes. Billy shook his head slightly, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I thought she was just adventurous. I never suspected anything like this." Tom reached over, placing a hand on his father's arm. "It's not your fault," he said softly, squeezing his dad's arm for reassurance. Billy looked up, offering a weak smile, his gratitude clear in his expression. They sat in silence for a while, the only sound the hum of the air conditioning in the room. Officer Rivera had managed to catch James just a few streets away from the church. Under questioning, he quickly broke down, spilling all the details of the scheme he and Jessica had devised. As it turned out, Jessica wasn't even her real name. She was actually Sarah Connors, a seasoned con artist with a long history of seducing wealthy men and then vanishing with their money. James wasn't just her accomplice, but also her partner, both in crime and in life. They had been running these scams for years, but nothing they'd attempted before was as elaborate or deadly as their plan for Billy. The insurance policy that Tom had found was just the beginning. Sarah had been methodically isolating Billy from his friends and family, subtly persuading him to change his will so that everything would go to her. Their plan was to stage a tragic accident during their honeymoon, collect the insurance payout and Billy's estate, and then disappear together to start a new life. As the full scope of Sarah's betrayal became clear, Billy seemed to shrink under the weight of it all. "How could I have been so blind?" he muttered, mostly to himself. "How did I not see what was happening?" Officer Jaden, who had been quietly taking notes, looked up with a soft expression. "Mr. William, don't beat yourself up over this. People like her are professionals. They've done this before, and they're very skilled at manipulating others. What matters now is that they didn't succeed, and that's thanks to your son." Billy looked over at Tom, his eyes a mix of pride and regret. "You're right," he said quietly. As they prepared to leave the station, Officer Jaden handed Billy his card. "If you think of anything else, or if Sarah tries to contact you, don't hesitate to call me any time." Billy tucked the card into his pocket and then turned to Tom. "Ready to go home, buddy?" Tom nodded, feeling the weight of the day's events settle over him. He was drained, both physically and emotionally. The ride home would be quiet, but for the first time in days, there was a glimmer of peace between father and son. The drive home was filled with silence, both Billy and Tom deep in their own thoughts. When they finally pulled into the driveway, Billy turned off the engine but didn't move to get out. Instead, he sat there, staring straight ahead, as if trying to find the right words. After a long pause, he finally spoke, his voice soft. The following weeks were a chaotic blur for Billy and Tom as they tried to pick up the pieces after Jessica's betrayal. Their once quiet lives were turned upside down. There were more meetings with the police, countless calls with lawyers trying to fix the legal nightmare Jessica had left behind, and an overwhelming amount of calls from friends, family, and even reporters who were curious about the wedding fiasco. Billy did his best to keep Tom away from the worst of it, but there was no avoiding the harsh reality they now faced. Despite the police's best efforts to track her down, she seemed to have vanished into thin air. Billy received regular updates, but as the days turned into weeks, the hope of finding her began to slip away. James, on the other hand, wasn't so lucky. He was caught and now facing the full consequences of his actions. In exchange for a lighter sentence, he provided the authorities with everything he knew about Jessica's past scams and their group of criminal associates. His testimony revealed that Jessica was part of a much larger, well-organized criminal operation, one that had been swindling people for years. For Tom, the thought of her seeking revenge kept him on edge, especially late at night when the house was too quiet. "What if she comes back?" Tom asked one night, his voice barely above a whisper. Billy ruffled his son's hair and smiled softly. "We're a team, remember?" he said, his tone reassuring. "You and me, buddy, against the world. Whatever happens, we've got each other's back." Tom nodded again, feeling just a little more secure each time his dad reminded him of their bond. While the fear of the unknown still lingered, knowing that they were in this together made it a little easier to sleep at night. As the weeks rolled by, life slowly began to settle back into something that resembled normal. Billy threw himself into his work, diving into extra projects to keep his mind from wandering. Tom focused on school, finding comfort in the routine of classes and homework. It felt safer, predictable. Then, 6 months after the wedding that wasn't, everything changed again. It was a crisp autumn afternoon when Officer Jaden showed up at their door, his face grave. "Mr. William," he said as Billy invited him in, "we found Jessica." Billy's heart raced. "You've arrested her?" Officer Jaden shook his head. "No, sir, I'm afraid. We found her body in a motel room just outside of Vegas. It appears she took her own life." The news hit Billy like a physical blow. Billy stumbled back, steadying himself against the wall. "She's dead," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Officer Jaden nodded solemnly. "Yes, sir. We believe she'd been there for a few days." There was a note. Just then, Tom came down the stairs, his energetic footsteps halting abruptly when he spotted the officer in their living room. "Dad?" he asked, his voice tinged with concern. He glanced between the two men, sensing something was wrong. Billy turned toward his son, his face pale and worn. "Tom, why don't you go to your room for a bit? I need to talk to Officer Jaden." Tom didn't move, his eyes flickering between his father and the officer. "Is it about Jessica?" he asked softly, his voice almost a whisper. Billy sighed, knowing there was no point in keeping the truth from his son. Tom had been through too much already to be shielded from this. "Yeah, buddy, it is. Come sit with us. We should talk about this together." Tea. The three of them sat in the living room, the air heavy with tension. Officer Jaden spoke gently, choosing his words carefully to shield Tom from the harshest details. He explained that Jessica, whose real name was Sarah, had been on the run for months, always staying just ahead of the law. But in the end, the pressure had caught up with her. "In her note," Officer Jaden said, his voice soft and careful, "she said she couldn't live with the guilt anymore. She expressed remorse for everything she had done." Billy sat in silence, his arm wrapped around Tom's shoulders. The room felt smaller, the walls closing in as he tried to absorb the news. He glanced down at Tom, who looked up at him, his young face full of worry. "Are you okay, Dad?" Tom asked, his voice small. Billy managed a weak smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "I don't know, buddy," he said honestly. "It's a lot to take in." Tom leaned into his father's side, seeking comfort. The room stayed quiet for a moment longer before Officer Jaden stood to leave. "I'll be in touch if there's anything else you need," he said gently, giving Billy a small nod before heading toward the door. As the door closed behind the officer, Billy let out a long, shaky breath. His mind was spinning with questions, regrets, and the weight of what had just happened. He looked down at Tom, who was still nestled close to him. "We're going to be okay," Billy said softly, though he wasn't entirely sure he believed it. But he knew they would figure it out together, just like they had before. Tom nodded, his small hand gripping Billy's arm a little tighter. "Yeah, Dad," he whispered. "We'll be okay." The past year had been filled with ups and downs, moments of betrayal, fear, and doubt. Yet, through it all, Billy and Tom had grown closer in ways they never expected. They had faced every challenge together, and now, after all the chaos, they were stronger for it. The story of how the young boy had stopped his father's wedding had become a powerful symbol of resilience, love, and the bond between father and son. It was a testament to how the deepest connections don't always come from perfect moments or fairy tale endings, but from the simple, unwavering love within a family.